So should we begin? What do you think? It's like people are still coming in.
Yeah, I say, Rabbi, go ahead and get us started, and I'll continue to admit people as they come.
Okay, so I will invite everyone to please go and put yourselves in mute. And as we did last time around, if you have any question or comment or what you want to say something, you either or unmute yourselves or write something using the chat, and we will be here to try to address your concerns, your questions, and the like. But for this second class, what we are going to do, or this is my hope, and Rabbi Laurie's hope, I hope as well, is to jump back into the beginnings of the development of the idea of the afterlife in our sources. Meaning, we spoke last time that we have a variety of visions or views on the afterlife, ranging from there's nothing to all sorts of things. And in the middle, you have like the agnostics who don't know if there is anything after, but they won't be so sure to deny it to begin with. But what I think it's an journey into the understanding of what we as members of the Jewish people get to understand about the afterlife. It begins by this journey back to the sources, and most important even is to understand the development of our ideas in the context of where we were. Okay, it's so. I will share my screen, so hopefully what I'm saying will be understood. Do you see there? Let me, the good thing about having two screens is that I can have you on one screen and the PowerPoint on the other screen.
We see it.
Perfect. So, first of all, we need to understand that when the Israelites come into being as a as a people, as they are trying to define their identities. This happens today and it happened back in the day. An important thing that happens when you are trying to define who you are is to understand what the surrounding peoples around you will think about all sorts of things. In the case of the afterlife, that is also one of the important things that we need to understand when we try to make sense of the Jewish view of the afterlife in times of the Bible. Okay, so the map here serves to remind us that we were just like, people used to pass through us in their way from two major poles of power, and there were two superpowers back in the times that we are talking about. One is Egypt, one is the Mesopotamia, Babylonia, okay, and the many different empires that were there. And we are not what I would call the superpower of the time. It's like, if with some differences, if we trace a line between Nashville and St. Louis, the land of Israel is a bit like Paducah. So it's not a bad thing, but it's not a major not that St. Louis and Nashville are major cities, but I try to keep it local. Okay, so I think that before we embark in understanding what the Jews or the Israelites had to say about the afterlife, we should try to understand what the surrounding neighbors, the superpowers of the time, had to say about the afterlife. So very briefly, do you know who that is? No reason you should know, but it's polite to ask. So that is Eresh Kigal, who happened to be the queen of the underworld in the Sumerian worldview. Okay, for the Babylonians, if we go to the Babylonian side of the map, Babylonians used to believe that there were like, and this was, shared by many, 3 layers: the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. And according to the Sumerians in this Mesopotamian region, everyone after dying would get to go to this underworld. This is the goddess of the underworld. According to the myth, she even kidnaps a different deity and marries that deity, or whatever. She has a family down there in the underworld, and everyone goes there. So it doesn't, whether you were a bad guy or a good guy, it doesn't matter. You get into the underworld. Now, the underworld in the Babylonian take is a bit of like a shadowy world, and so it's metaphysically very far apart from what we are used to here. But among other things, the myths from the Babylonian culture say that one of the reasons you have to have many kids is that once you are dead, your kids will make libations, and with that you will be able to drink, because in the underworld you only get cocktails of dry dust. So you need someone that will give you something to drink. Okay, but the interesting piece for us is the existence of the underworld and the fact that everyone goes there regardless of how good or bad they were. Okay, now what happened in Egypt? Anyone knows? Egypt has a very developed vision of the afterlife. There is the book of death, and there is a bunch of stuff happening in Egypt. And the afterlife in Egypt is not for everyone. Okay. Anybody knows what that, what I'm showing is about? Have you ever seen this? When I was growing up, this was like amazing, but today,
weighing the heart.
Very good. So it's like, how was that? How was that process of weighing the heart? Why is that important?
It determines whether you go to which part of the afterlife you go to, which river you cross.
Correct. So this is very interesting. When you die, you have to be prepared. And when you are, dead in Egypt, you will be mummified. By the way, some of our characters in the Bible, Jacob is mummified as well because he was in Egypt at the time. You get ready for the path into the underworld, but in order to go into the boat that will take you to where you need to be, there is this important moment in which your heart is weighted against Ma'at's feather, which is, Ma'at is the deity of truth. She has a feather, and only if that is in balance, you can go. Now, why to me this is such an interesting image, especially when we are reading right now in the Torah about the plagues in Egypt? Do you remember that one of the scenes that happens after the plagues, one after the other, is this idea of Pharaoh hardening his heart, or God hardening Pharaoh's heart? I think that there is a whole lot of reason to believe that whoever is writing those lines, which appear only in the context of Pharaoh, is thinking about this. So Pharaoh is not being punished in this life. Pharaoh seems to be also being punished in the afterlife, in the Egyptian view of the afterlife, because his heart is so heavy that he won't be able to pass this test. Okay? To me, it's an interesting, since we are talking about this, right, when we are reading about Pharaoh's heart, this idea of the afterlife is interesting, and maybe there's no way to know, but maybe is fueling the way the story of the Exodus from Egypt is told. Okay? Now, we have Egypt, we have Babylon. The question is, what did we do, or what did the people in Canaan, in the land of Israel, where we came to go, did? Okay, so let me share a couple of texts, and then I will open for questions. I don't want this to be a lecture in which I'm the one only speaking, but I have a question for all of you, also for Rabbi Laurie. You know, in the book of Leviticus, we read, do not turn to ghosts and do not inquire of familiar spirits. Okay? Don't inquire the dead. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, we read that you shall not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of these nations. So these whole practices are in the context of identity shaping, and what do we take, what do we adapt, what do we move away from. And among the things that we should not be embracing from the surrounding peoples that were around, one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. Okay, among other things. So my question to you is this. Are these practices real? Number one. Number two, did Israelites engage in these practices as Jews or Israelites, or not? So what I want you to reflect upon, we have all these things. What's the meaning of these things? Why is the Torah forbidding us in a couple of different places that we shouldn't engage in these type of practices that somehow point to the fact that there is an afterlife? Because if you can summon a ghost, that means that the ghosts are there to be summoned, right? Which eventually will hint to the fact that there is some sort of an afterlife. What do you think about that? That is what they saw, this is what they understood to be the case, or not?
So feel free to unmute, or you can put it in the chat if you'd like, but you can just go ahead and jump in.
It seems to me that the fact that they're pointing out not to do these things, that there was some belief that there were ghosts around or spirits, and it had to be told to them not to do it.
So, yes.
Good. Continue on. Why? I mean, why? Why would they? Why would it be so important that they not engage in this kind of practice?
Because it should just. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, I think it was Ron, but too many, which is a great thing. So,
Ron, go ahead.
It seems to me that this reinforces monotheism, because if you're going to look to these other areas to inquire or call upon, then you are perhaps turning your face away from the one God.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate a bit. It's like, so consulting with dead people is what moves us away from the monotheistic idea, or it is the fact that is the practice that it is done by polytheist peoples. So the problem is not with the practice, the problem is with who is the practitioner. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm just asking the question because I think that all of these things are connected to what we took regarding the afterlife and what we pushed aside, or how many of these things actually intermingled in many different ways.
So Rabbi, Amy McCoy has her hand up. I want to come to Amy, and I want to point out that in the chat, Nanette responded that perhaps we're not to dwell on the afterlife as compared to living life in the present. But Amy, go ahead and share what you were going to say as well.
That's exactly what I was, on the same line, to be in the present, live life in the present, don't focus on the afterlife.
Nice.
I think
Okay,
I think it was also a way of creating an identity. I mean, we create identities like Republicans and Democrats. One's red, one's blue. One's an elephant, one's a donkey. You forge identities. And I think that because you don't want to have the same identity as the people around you who are believing in ghosts, you don't believe in ghosts.
Very good. Or it might be that other folks believe in ghosts, so you don't want to believe in ghosts.
Right.
And it's like, I think that all of these things, and I don't know if Susan, you also had something to add? You need to unmute.
I was also going to say what James said, that it has to do with identity. You want to be different than all of the people, or you will get swallowed up by these large powers.
I think that, again, and this is why we began this second class, by trying to give you a bigger context because as we understand what other folks around thought about the afterlife, we may be able to get a sense of what or why did we do these things or not the others. Okay?
And
So,
Rabbi,
yes,
Pam wanted to interject as well.
yes.
I just wanted to add to what everybody's saying, and also to build on to last week's discussion. I think every culture, every person has the questions of what happens after, and I think it's a way to explain that, to mitigate the fear that we all have of the afterlife. It's some way of explaining, because we are creatures of wanting answers. So I think that with each culture, each group of people, we take away something that conforms to the collective's identity and beliefs, to be able to give that comfort and also to mitigate the fear that people have of the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Pam. And Steve added in the chat, but what about the fact that we say Kaddish to remember our dead? Why do we do that if we're not supposed to inquire of familiar spirits?
So any answer to that, Rabbi?
Oh, my answer would be that it's complicated by memory and our desire to give eternality to the soul. So I think it's separate from this idea of conjuring ghosts and soothsayers. That's what the Torah is warning us against. It falls into a different category. That's how I would respond.
That's good. It's like, to this, I will also remind everyone that, as the French, philosopher, thinker, Michel Foucault used to say, these concepts have a genealogy. And what we are trying to show you is the development of some of the ideas. So by the time of the Bible, there is no Kaddish, and there is no, none of that is developed. But eventually, we will certainly have a very broad and fertile visions of the afterlife. Okay. So just for you to know, there are a couple of books, for example, but for example, do you see this book, Thick? It's like Jewish views on the afterlife. So you want to see everything from the very mainstream to the extremely awkward and bizarre. It's a long, thick book. So we have a lot to say about the afterlife. But what I want to show you is that we didn't begin with a lot to say about the afterlife. And I think that, what I will try to show you is that by and large, the Bible doesn't seem to have a hold of an idea of the afterlife. And only at the very end of the Bible, we will start to find some of the seeds that will grow exponentially by the time of the rabbis.
And Rabbi?
Yes.
I just wanted to add, per Steve Abelman's question about Kaddish, that it seems to me that the Bible, as you just said, is perhaps more concerned with differentiation and establishing a new nation with its own unique identity that separates itself from the neighboring pagan nations and tribes in the ancient Near East. And that we, as living, breathing Jews, descendants of the Israelites, that we are spiritual seekers. And that's the component of eternality of the soul, and why we say Kaddish, and why we continue to seek answers as to what happens, if anything, after this life. It's the natural inclination, but it's a different intention, I think, behind it from what we see happening in these texts.
And I will add something else to something that Pam was saying before regarding this thing about seeking answers and looking for some of the to ease the pain of the unknown. Some of that you can actually see it also in the inner conversation that the Bible has with itself. So, for example, the Torah seems to become very harsh against this whole notion of seeking the ghosts, summoning the dead, or looking Again, part of the reasons why the Torah is against summoning the dead, one is related to the fact that other peoples around used to do it, number one. Number two, it might be that the Bible, in most of its texts, doesn't believe in this type of continued existence after, number two. And number three, even then, the angst, the pain, the anxiety of the unknown gives us texts like this one from the first book of Samuel. Okay, again, the idea is not to read every text. We are happy to share all these texts later if you want to delve deeper and to read everything. But I did the job highlighting what I wanted, but I will give you the context. King Saul, the first king of Israel, the unified kingdom of Israel. Okay, eventually, according to what we learn in the Bible, King Saul is no longer favored by God, and so he's about to die, and he's about to fight against the Philistines in the war that actually will get him killed. And see how this text in chapter 28 in the first book of Samuel begins. Saul inquired the Lord, but the Lord did not answer. That is where we create the silence, the unknown, and the anxiety and the pain. So Saul knows that if you want to know something, you should call God. The problem is, what happens if God is not picking up the phone? Because you are doing according to the book, but if you call and there is no response, Saul says, find me a woman who consults ghosts, so that I can go to her and inquire through her. So he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing, but out of the desperation of not knowing. Okay, and again, we see this. This is not something that he should be doing, we can say on one end, and on the other end we say, but we understand. The guy is in pain. He doesn't know what's going on. He is afraid of the Philistines. He knows that his life is, on a very fine line. So he goes and finds this woman. And it's interesting because the fact that there is a woman doing this also shows us that there was like an illegal ghost summoning network, underground, whatever. It's like, so if you have your connections, you can get these folks in this other type of underworld. Okay, it's like in the underground you get these things. But see what
like the old school dark web.
Yes, correct. So if you look for it, you will find it. So Saul, see what's going on here. We shouldn't do this because other folks do this. So the king, as the exemplar of the law, says, don't do it. He himself ends up doing it. And not only he wants to do it, there is an underground network of these type of people. So if you want them, you can find them. But she is smart. So he says he goes in disguise because he doesn't want to, for people to know that he is actually going against the law. But we all know, people with power trying to go against the law. It's kind of, some things never change. Saul is trying to pretend that he's not him. And the woman says, you know what Saul has done? How he has banned the use of ghosts and familiar spirits in the land? Is this a trap? Do you want to kill me? So she knows that, what she's doing is not according to the law. And he wants to bring Samuel, the prophet who's already dead. And then she recognizes that the guy speaking or seeking her services is the king himself. Okay? So far, we don't have any clear idea of whether this is going to work or not. But what happens? She summons Samuel, who is pretty dead by the time, and he shows up. It's like, bang. So if you think that there is no afterlife, how on earth do you explain this story? Okay? And see what Samuel, who is awoken, or now he's awake from his slumber, from his dream, or from his being dead, he says, why have you disturbed me and brought me up? It's like, why are you bothering me? And so, well, I called God, but God is not picking up the phone. So I had to ask somebody. spoiler alert, Samuel is not only disturbed, but he says, you're going to die in the next war. So, sei gesund. Sometimes it's better not to know, okay? But here the point is, do we have an afterlife or not? Do we believe in any of these or not? And what I want to present in front of you, and this text to me is awesome, is it a reminder that the Bible is not a monolith, that there is not one answer and that's it. And that even if the, how do you say, the official answer was no ghosts, death, or whatever, people in moments of pain would go and try to seek answers from whomever could give them the answers, okay? Up to this point, that there's plenty more to say, but questions, comments, concerns, reactions to this text. I don't know if you knew the text or not, but it's there. You can find it.
Rabbi, this is Pam. Do you have your hand up? I don't know if it's from before. Pam.
Oh, no, I don't. No,
okay.
I don't. I was from before.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Yep. And so I think Steve Potash.
Yes, I have a question. The discussion thus far has suddenly made me wonder, is the soul and the afterlife synonymous, or is there a distinction between the two?
It's a great question, because I think that to understand the development of the idea of the afterlife, we need to understand the independence that won't exist until this time between body and soul, which we spoke about last week and we will continue to speak. But Rabbi, please.
No, I just think it's interesting. I was speaking yesterday morning with the chaplaincy students at Vanderbilt and trying to help them understand how they might approach Jewish families and Jewish patients differently. And they asked, well, what is sort of the dogma around what comes next? I said, oh, it's great. We're offering the 6-part series you can tap into on what comes next. But we spent a lot of time talking about the both separation and interconnectedness of body and soul. And I think it's important to think about it that way. Our liturgy presents it that way. And yet, so we know that our soul lives within our body, and yet we don't talk about the eternality of the body. We talk about that of the soul and how the soul lives on, and our responsibility for that, for those who came before us, and our longing for that for ourselves. I wanted to point out that, and I may have told this story last time. I'm not sure if I did, but when I was just a student in seminary and I was doing a chaplaincy unit at the local hospital, I walked into a gentleman's room and I introduced myself. I said, my name is Laurie. I'm a student rabbi and a student chaplain here, and could I come in and visit with you? And he said, I don't believe in God. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to take that as my invitation to come on in. And then the next thing he said before I spoke again was, why is this happening to me? And that question, why is this happening to me, is in fact a theological question. So, and I say that because even if we're not entirely certain about what our views are or our relationship might be with the divine, whether there is one or not, what that's like. And that's completely appropriate, because as the people Israel, we are meant to be God wrestlers. That's what Israel means. We struggle with this, with God and our relationship with God, and struggle is not a bad thing. But we also struggle with this idea of what comes next. Is this all there is for us? That's the soul asking that question. The body understands. We've seen what happens to bodies when we've escorted loved ones to their resting place, either at burial or whatever their wishes might be for what happens to their body when they pass. But the soul, there's just such an unknown around it, and that's that spark of the divine that's within us that we can only somewhat know and constantly explore. So I just wanted to put that out there, as far as the body and the soul are interconnected, and yet they are very separate at the same time.
Any other questions or comments that you may have? Okay, to what Rabbi Laurie said, like just a reminder, we will see the beginning or the separation between body and soul as also the, as a result of our encounter with Hellenism. Okay, so before that, there is a concept of soul, but the soul is pretty much attached to the body. Okay, and again, in this stage of the game, which is the Bible, so it's not what Jews believe today. It's like the earliest iteration of the conversation. We don't speak about the eternality of the soul. There is not something that we see in the Bible. Not because, maybe it was a concept that they didn't have any interest or they didn't develop. It doesn't mean that there is no soul and that their soul is not eternal. It is that they didn't speak about it.
But I do think there is a notion that character matters as far as the
Yes.
length of one's life. So sin shortens life, and Masim Tovim lengthens. Good deeds lengthen.
Correct.
So
Correct.
there's a notion of kind of character, something going on.
Yes, in this life. So it's, death can happen because of your wrongdoings, or your days might be extended because of your, good deeds.
Yeah.
But that doesn't reflect necessarily on what happens later. Okay.
Right.
Now, I want to ask you, this phrase shows up like 4 or 5 different times in the book of Genesis. Maybe you have heard this, by Yasef el Amav, when Abraham dies, when Isaac dies, when Ishmael dies, when Joseph dies. It's like a bunch of folks dying. When Aaron, Moses' brother, dies later on in the book of Numbers, we read, and he was gathered to his kin. And so my question to you, I have an idea, but my question to you is, how do you understand this, number one? And do you think that this is a hint to the life in the afterlife? And you can make your case. It's like,
So the text again, oh, you just put it up, right? He was gathered to his kin. Great, thank you.
So, if you read the story of Abraham, and Abraham grew old and was satiated with his days, and then he dies, and Vayasef el Amav, and he was gathered to his kin, okay, to the members of his people, which in the case of Abraham is already very interesting because he's the first one of the people. So who is he joining? Okay. But
just jump in with what you think this might mean. And I just want to remind everyone, there's no wrong answers. We're all trying to figure this out together. So the more
and for me, it's a very, some people will, and some traditional Jewish commentators in the Middle Ages will certainly make the point of the soul leaving the body and joining in with the souls of many others, which is like very, a developed understanding of the afterlife. In the Bible, I think that to begin with, Lorna, do you have something?
And so does John. John's got something too.
Okay.
I was just going to say that, it could also be looked at as he's now passed on amongst all his people before him whom you remember.
Okay, nice. So there is this idea of he's going the way of the world, meaning like, his kin before they died, he's dying as well. John, you had something to add?
Yeah, I'm going to say he was, his memory is gathered in his kin. Those surviving him contain his memory and his acts and his being.
Okay, so the continuation is related to those who stay. Okay, he's gathered with those who passed, and his memory should be transmitted by the generations coming after. Any other take of what does it mean to be gathered to his kin?
I think it's a message of comfort.
How?
I think that, we often, at funerals or, we often say, well, like my dad, I would say, well, he's with Granny Katie, and, I feel comforted that they're not alone. Right. So I think that, giving the uncertainty of who wrote this and when it was written, exact time, I think that, again, we're all searching for answers. We're all searching a way of trying to escape that fear and that pain. And I think it's just for me, it's a message of comfort.
Okay, nice. Again, in medieval readings, this will be understood with this very, image of the afterlife, that probably we all heard that in the afterlife, people are reunited with one another. Yeah, probably you've heard this idea. It's that is used and whatever many times. Vicky?
Yeah, I am a nurse, and so I've seen people at the end of life, and so often they will bring up conversations with people who have already passed. So I think there's something about it as people are doing that passage, that there's a relation with that.
So in this book, again, not in the Bible, but this book will call into, this idea that when you're about to make the passing from this world to the next, you see familiar faces of those that are already gone, who are like coming to help you walking as you pass into the next world. Okay, so it's an idea that shows. Steve.
Although Abraham really is the first one to buy a burial plot, I think to some degree this may be the beginning of a cemetery. He was gathered to his kin.
I think that you are right. And my reading of the text is exactly like that. So later on, this will be used. Sorry if you hear the noise. We are renovating the synagogue. So it's like, we make a good use of our time when we are close. Sorry. I think that the idea in the medieval times that will say that we meet soul with our dear ones who left this world before, I think that in the original context is exactly what Steve just said. It's the idea that we would put together members of the family in the same plots. That is exactly what Me'arat HaMachpelah means in the text. We have a family plot. We come together, we bury ourselves together, so we are gathered
together
with the members of our people who came before us.
But it's interesting because just even looking at the root for the Hebrew Vayasef, this idea of building upon or an adding that then creates strength because it becomes more numerous, would lend itself to your comment, Steve, that this idea though that, that when one passes, that it strengthens their people, that they become their whole family becomes stronger as they are added to it. It's I'm still fleshing out the idea, but it's an interesting use of an interesting word that's chosen. That it's not just that you're placed in the same location burial wise, but there's something about the power of that tribe or that family or the strength of it that becomes even stronger, as opposed to, oh, you've lost a member of your family and now you've dwindled. It's this idea that it's a strengthening. It's something positive.
So, and to that, it's like the idea of coming together. So it's, again, even if there is no afterlife, there is still a sense of community after the death. You see, from the very beginning. Later on, we will have this idea of the afterlife together. But the idea is, we, even when, and we tend to believe as death as a very solitary experience, yet the Bible seems to be pointing to the fact that we are still together. We are adding ourselves to those who were before us. Okay? And I think that there is a lot of strength in that idea as well. Now, moving forward with this whole notion of there is not much of an afterlife. If you remember Adam and Eve, and you remember that Adam and Eve will eat from what they should not be eating, the curse that God gives to Adam is dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So you come from the earth, you go back to the earth, period. Okay? If you ask Ecclesiastes, if you ever read the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a very pessimistic book, if you want, the whole point of his pessimism is the fact that man or human beings and animals are the same, and the end is the same. We all drop dead eventually. Again, if you have a developed vision of the afterlife, you don't have to be so grumpy. It's like the Grinch. I was teaching the other day for Introduction to Judaism. I was saying, yeah, Ecclesiastes is like the Grinch. So he doesn't steal Christmas, but he's not very happy, and he's not a happy camper. And part of the unhappiness of Ecclesiastes is the fact that he knows that he's about to die and there's no way out. Okay? The book of Psalms, the dead cannot praise the Lord. Okay? There's no way for us to connect with God after dying. And again, there is this idea that we will see in just a moment. For it is not Sheol that praises you, and only the living can give thanks to you. So we find here, I'm sorry if it is too noisy.
It's not that loud, Rabbi. It's okay. You're doing great.
It's only loud in my brain. But
yeah.
So we find here a very important concept when you go and try to make sense of the afterlife or the lack thereof in the context of the Bible, which is the idea of Sheol. Okay? So what is Sheol? The answer is nobody knows exactly what Sheol is. The Bible will give a bunch of synonyms or words that you can attach to Sheol. It's nice that the word Sheol in Hebrew is connected to the word She'elah, question. That may hint to the fact that we don't have a clue. So it's like when you die, you go to that place in which, you know, it's Sheol. It's the land to which we don't have many answers, but we may have a lot of questions. Okay? So, for example, do you remember Jacob and Joseph? Do you remember the famous scene when the brothers come with the bloody multicolored coat to tell Jacob that, well, actually they don't tell much. They let Jacob run wild with his own assumptions. But when he recognizes the coat, this is what he says: I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's like at the time of death, I will be in mourning, and this is where I'm going, to Sheol. When later on the brothers want to take Benjamin down to Egypt for food, Jacob says once again, if you go with him and something happens to him, you will send my white head down to Sheol in grief. The texts are not helping us much in understanding what Sheol is.
But we know,
yes.
we know that it's not necessarily always a punishment. It doesn't have necessarily a positive or negative to it.
Okay.
We just see that,
there's nothing. It's like, but for example, it's like, see what's going on with this prophecy from Isaiah, okay? Which he's speaking to a foreign king, and he says something about Sheol. And again, the exercise for us is, let's try to see if we can learn whether Sheol is a physical place, is a metaphysical place. You know, part of the conversation here is that division between the physical and the metaphysical. That, you know, is also the question between the body and the soul, if you want. Okay? So this is what he says. Sheol, so to the king, to the foreign king, Sheol below us a steer to greet you coming, or your coming, rousing for you the shades of all earth's chieftains, raising from their thrones all the kings of nations. All speak up and say to you, so you have been stricken as we were, you have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, and the strains of your lutes. Worms are to be your bed, maggots your blanket. Okay, the prophets can be very poignant in the words they choose. It's not a fun image to to think about. But so the question for me, from me to you is Sheol a physical place or a metaphysical place?
Great question.
Any takes? Again, try to understand the text in its context. By what the prophet is saying, Sheol is like the Egyptian underworld, like the Babylonian underworld, or it's actually a description, a very poetic, even if yucky description of a grave.
Or it's a description of what we experience emotionally and mentally upon losing someone important to us. Because if it's not a punishment, if it's where we all go, and that's to the metaphysical, Rabbi, that you mentioned, that if everybody goes there, regardless of moral character, that it may be an early sort of description of the mourning process. Step one, Sheol.
Could it mean that it's just the grave site? And we're taking this as something from the Egyptians or the Babylonians, but maybe it's just you're going to your grave, and this is what's going to happen to you in your grave. You're going to have a lot of little friends coming to visit you.
I think that, certainly the prophet is playing with that very unnerving, very disturbing image. And I think personally, when he's speaking about all the people, the chieftains and the other kings of the nations that are waiting for him, that is the metaphor of even you with all your power are gonna end up in the same hole that anyone else or everyone else, okay? That is what is waiting for you, which is an idea that gets replicated in other texts in the Jewish tradition. But see on the other side, because again, part of what we are trying to do today, and there is not too much else, so it's like we will be fine or on time, is this idea that on one end, the texts seem to be implying that once you get to Sheol, that's it. It's a dark, deep hole from where there is no way back. And yet, if you look in the book of Psalms, it's like on Psalm 30, we read, "You brought me up from Sheol." So there is a way back from Sheol. We don't know exactly how. It might be that in this case, Sheol is used also to speak about the moment of transition itself. When you are very sick and you believe that you are very close to the end, and that's what Psalm 30 is about. Okay, it's like, "Oh Lord, I cried out to you and you healed me." So it's someone who recovered from a very complicated moment in life. Okay, but the other psalm, and then again we may start seeing some of the seeds of the development of the idea of the afterlife. Psalm 49 is a psalm in which the psalmist again says that it doesn't matter how much power do you have, you're gonna die. Okay, and yet says, "Such is the fate of those who are self-confident, the end of those pleased with their own talk. Sheep like they head for Sheol." So everybody is going to Sheol no matter what. "With death as their shepherd, the upright shall rule over them as daybreak, and their form shall waste away in Sheol till its nobility be gone." So it doesn't matter how powerful you are, I'm sorry. "But God will redeem my life from the clutches of Sheol, for he will take me." What does that mean?
But it could be, and there's been some really wonderful comments in the chat too that I want to make sure people see along the way. It could be this idea that Sheol is the ultimate equalizer. I mean, if we take Rick's notion that it's the location, and we combine it, meaning the grave, with this idea that you're putting forth, Rabbi, that it could be that moment that moment where it's the threshold of moving out of this life, that it is this ultimate equalizer. And perhaps that cry out in Psalm 39 is our understandable resistance to let go of the ego, of there's still within us, even then, knowing there's still within us this longing for comfort, but God will gather me, God will bring me. Yeah, I won't just be reduced to no matter. We can't even fully grasp that ultimate equalizing place or moment, because how we are constructed won't allow for it. We are meaning seekers, and that's a positive element of the ego. The ego is not all bad. It propels us to do incredible things. So I think that psalm, which psalms I believe are human lament, is our human lament of no, even though ultimately we know that is our fate.
I agree, and I think that in many psalms, it's the pain of facing death, facing the unknown, and trying to give answers, different answers, maybe from the ones we give today, with the tools that they have at hand. Okay, and I think that again, the fact that they see Sheol as an equalizer, so we go, all of us, and yet there is a chance for redemption, even if it's like we don't know exactly what that redemption is looking like at this stage. At least is this again facing the anxiety and the pain of our death, and even more, it's the death of those that we love about, that many times will put us in a much difficult place. Before I come to the last couple of texts, Dina Goldstein is asking regarding, when Sheldon Adelson died a couple of weeks ago, the idea that he was buried in the Mount of Olives because he would be resurrected there. I will speak about the seeds of resurrection today, but the point is, the Talmud will say that at the time of the resurrection, we will speak about Talmud and Jewish views of the afterlife in the Talmud next time around. According to one passage in the Talmud, people, the resurrection happens in Jerusalem. So again, it's like, this is creative writing. Don't take it literally, but this is what the Talmud says. At the time of the resurrection, when the Messiah comes, everyone will go underground, like crawling to Jerusalem, and we will get like resurrected from there. So if you are buried right next door, it's a less of a schlep that you need to do underground. So it's like, it's a good deal if that is what you want. But so if you are in farther away, it will be more time that you get. Like you have to crawl like a zombie until you get there. But that's what the Talmud says, and that is what explains why some people are very eager to be buried in Jerusalem. Okay, not the only reason, but in the context of resurrection, it's not that only those in Jerusalem will resurrect, but resurrection happens there. So we need to get there. So it would be crowded at the time. Last few things. So speaking of resurrection, there is a famous story in the first book of Kings about Prophet Elijah bringing back a boy to life. So the Bible brings a story about a young boy who dies, and it's very clear that the boy is dead, and Elijah somehow gets the boy to be alive once again. So it doesn't say anything about the afterlife, but it says something about dying and coming back. Okay, there is a similar story with Elisha. So Elisha and Elijah. So Elijah the prophet is the first. Elisha is his student. He will be able to do something along those lines as well. Then we have, this is a problem with the source. It's in Ezekiel. Okay, the book of Ezekiel has the very famous prophecy about the dried bones. which I don't know if you ever heard about this prophecy, but Ezekiel at some point has this prophecy about bones that will come back to life. But it's interesting that in that prophecy, God is asking the prophet, "Oh mortal, can these bones live again?" To which Ezekiel says, "I don't have a clue, you know," which is interesting insight into what they knew or they didn't. And then God says, "These bones will live, but these bones are the whole house of Israel. So I will open your graves and lift out of there, out of the graves, and I will bring you to the land of Israel." The question here is he talking literally or metaphorically?
Right.
What does it mean when the prophet is speaking about the dry bones that will be reborn somehow? Okay. Some people may actually, some people use this text to speak about the idea of resurrection.
Yeah.
Literally. But there is a lot of reasons to believe that the prophet here is using the metaphor of the bones to speak about the national rebirth of the people of Israel. Remember, when did Ezekiel prophesy? Do you know when and where?
Destruction of the first temple.
So Ezekiel is a contemporary of the destruction of the first temple of Jerusalem, but he's not in Jerusalem, he's in Babylon.
Right.
Okay, so makes sense that after the tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem and the fact that the Jews are in the lowest point in their history, the prophet will speak about national rebirth in the idea, or using the idea of the bones that are refleshed back again, but all together. So it's not a personal resurrection, it's a national rebirth. Okay?
And poetic, which is not unlike other prose that we encounter in the Bible. But when we want to forward an idea that meets our mission or our theology, we can become literalists.
Correct. So this is the ongoing dangerous game, but it is what it is. It's like some people love to read some texts literally and then some other texts metaphorically. We all do the same, but again, tell me how you read the texts and I will be able to tell you what your agenda is.
Yes.
So in the selection of the texts that you make and in the way you read these texts or other texts, and again, a lot of the ongoing conversation about so many subjects is based on that. The last text I have for you is this text from the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is the last book in terms of the when was it composed to be included in the biblical canon. We are talking about 3rd century, 2nd century, something like that. It's like very, very late in the game. And Daniel, which is different from the rest of the Bible, will bring this verse in which already speaks not about the national rebirth or a metaphoric resurrection. Daniel is already speaking about many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth. So those who are dead will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. So Daniel, very late text, is giving us the first seeds of some sort of eternal, not even eternal life, an afterlife that is connected to the concept of resurrection that doesn't happen for everyone. It's interesting. It happens for the good guys to eternal life, but it looks like it's like eternal in the body in this text.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the very wicked guys, is eternal for, like, I don't know, think about the food you abhor the most, and this is what you get for the rest of your eternality. So it's like if you're a wicked guy, that is what you get from now and forever. So in the Bible, the resurrection that we see is the resurrection of some bodies. One verse, okay? The Bible is 929 chapters. One verse. speaking about some sort of reawakening of the bodies and some sort of eternal life in the bodies. Okay? And the last thing I have to say,
heaven and hell story.
There is no heaven and hell here, although, again, the development of the ideas of heaven and hell will come as an afterthought or as the way we kept struggling with our texts, the traditions that we met around us, and the way we tried to make sense of what was going on through our own selves and souls and thoughts. By the way, and this is the last thing I have to say, this idea of the resurrection shows up for the first time around the 4th century before the Common Era from the Zoroastrians. So the Zoroastrians, Zarathustra, and those folks began speaking about resurrection. Interestingly enough, we began by trying to see how much was taken from Babylon, from Egypt, from the Canaanites, how much we took, in this case for the Zoroastrians, and when we meet in 2 weeks, how significant was our meeting with the Hellenist world. Okay, it's like, so our identity was never built in a vacuum. It is always, up until our days, a conversation between our texts, the surroundings, and the state of our souls. And I think it's important for us to see that. And Annette, or I seen Annette with the mic open. So
yeah, it seems as though this little passage, the Christians ran with it.
Well, you're right, Annette. And the question I would ask as Rabbi was speaking, which is, what do you all make of the fact that there are over 900 chapters in our Bible, and we have this verse in Daniel? What does that say, if anything, to you?
Yeah, it seemed like those who were looking for another avenue, like for me, it seems very Christian resurrection, with Jesus, etc. So that particular passage almost gave like a right to, oh, wait a minute, maybe, and then they kind of took that portion and henceforth we have, another faith developing, and they piggybacked on that particular verse. That's what it hit me as.
Oh, again, it's like we need to. I agree, it's right, but the same has been done with the abortion. Okay, it's like same old. Now, resurrection will be taken as part of the core beliefs in Judaism. Okay, Tchiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead, show up in the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides will write about. Funny thing, or spoiler alert, or a teaser for you to come back, is that when you analyze what Maimonides actually thought about the resurrection of the dead, he wasn't very, very fond of that idea. And in his life was accused that he didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. So he had to go out publicly saying, I believe, I so much believe that I will put it as part of the 13 principles of faith that Judaism has. It doesn't make any sense.
But he has it out, because there can be a physical resurrection, and I believe that Machai Meitim is speaking so much about a spiritual resurrection. But we know, those of us who are Reformed Jews, that our classical reformers were so put off by the notion of resurrection being even considered physical that they just removed it from the liturgy entirely. And whereas if you're at West End and praying, you have Machai Meitim. If you're at Congregation Micah and praying, you have Machai et HaKol, the one who restores all, as opposed to restores life.
So yeah, Rabbi, invited to close if you want.
Well, I mean, I have nothing left to say, because you did such an incredible job teaching us today, and I'm grateful for it. It was a wonderful session. So these are the important questions to be asking. I hope your wheels continue to be turning, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Don't be alarmed when you see that the Zoom link shows for every Wednesday. That's just the way Zoom works. We have to set it up to be a reoccurring weekly class, but we are every other week. And I think there's one that's a little bit different in March, but for now, just know that we're together again on Wednesday, February 10th. And we'll look forward to seeing you. Meanwhile, happy hump day and an early Shabbat Shalom to all.
Thank you.
Happy to Shabbat this
Thank
evening.
you.
Take care, you all. Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Rabbi.
Thank you.